I can't keep doing this back and forth. Call me when she dies. Then we can actually talk.
She didn't hear him limp into that hospital hallway that night. She heard the change in his voice instead, the one he never used with her anymore, soft and eager, the way he used to talk to her 12 years earlier, when they were still young, and everything felt possible. She was lying in a bed she couldn't leave, tubes threaded through her arm, a machine beside her tracking every breath she managed to take. Her name is Sarah Whitfield, and this is the story she still finds hard to tell without her hands shaking. 3 weeks earlier, a truck had run a red light and turned her ordinary Tuesday morning into a fight for her life. She survived, her marriage did not, and the man she'd promised to grow old with was standing 12 feet from her hospital bed, believing she was too sedated to understand a single word, when he said the sentence that would follow her for the rest of her life. "Call me when she dies." She didn't move. She didn't cry out. She lay there with her eyes half closed, her body wrecked, and listened to her husband, Daniel Whitfield, speak about a future that no longer had room for her in it, as if she were already a memory, instead of a woman still breathing in the bed beside him. In that moment, something inside her went very quiet and very still, the way the ocean goes still right before it turns. She would spend the next year learning to walk again, learning to speak again, and learning, piece by piece, exactly who her husband had quietly become while she wasn't looking. What she didn't know yet, lying in that hospital bed unable to lift her own arm, was that the accident was only the beginning of everything she still had to lose, and everything she still had to find the strength to survive. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. By the time Sarah left that hospital, she was no longer the same woman who had driven to work that Tuesday morning, with a coffee in one hand and a grocery list in the other. Something in her had shifted, quietly and permanently, the way a house settles after a long winter, its foundation never quite the same again, even once the frost is gone. This is her story, told the way she finally chose to tell it, from the girl who fell in love young, to the wife who stopped being seen, to the woman who learned, in the hardest year of her life, exactly what she was made of. Sarah grew up in Springfield, Ohio, the younger of 2 daughters in a house where money was tight, but affection never was. Her father worked at a tire plant for almost 30 years, and her mother cleaned houses on the side to help cover whatever the plant paycheck didn't stretch to reach. Sarah has always said her childhood taught her 2 things that shaped the rest of her life without her even realizing it at the time: how to work hard without complaining, and how to keep loving people even when loving them cost you something. Her sister Rachel, 3 years older, was the one who taught her to ride a bike in the church parking lot down the street, and the one who sat with her on the porch the night their grandmother passed, neither of them saying much of anything, just sitting together in the quiet. That closeness between the 2 sisters never faded as they grew older, and it would end up mattering more than either of them could have known. Years later, in a guest bedroom neither of them ever expected Sarah to be recovering in. Sarah met Daniel Whitfield on a warm evening in Dayton, at a mutual friend's birthday party, back when she was 23, and still figuring out who she wanted to become. She remembers him standing near the kitchen doorway, quiet in a room full of loud people, the kind of quiet that made her want to walk over and find out what was behind it. They talked for nearly 2 hours that night, about nothing important, about everything important, and Sarah went home and told Rachel she'd just met someone she couldn't stop thinking about. Neither of them had much money in those days. Daniel was finishing his engineering degree and working nights at a warehouse to help cover tuition. Sarah was juggling 2 jobs while trying to break into marketing, typing up resumes on a second-hand laptop with a cracked corner. They didn't have much, but for a long time, they had each other, and for a long time, that felt like enough to build an entire life on. She remembers the early dates most clearly, not the expensive ones, because there weren't any, but the small ones. A picnic in a park with sandwiches Daniel had made himself, badly, the peanut butter thick enough to stick to the roof of her mouth, and both of them laughing about it instead of caring. A drive with no destination, just to see where the road went. Windows down, the radio turned up loud enough that neither of them had to talk if they didn't want to. Sarah says she fell in love with Daniel slowly, the way you fall asleep, not all at once, but in a series of small moments that added up before she even noticed it happening. In those early years, Daniel used to tuck small notes into Sarah's lunch bag before she left for work, nothing that cost him anything except a few quiet minutes, a joke, a line reminding her she was loved, sometimes just a doodle that made her laugh on the drive to the office. She kept every single one of those notes in a shoebox at the back of their closet, and she still has that shoebox today, sitting in a house Daniel has never once set foot inside. She wants you to hold on to that image of him, the boy who wrote her notes before sunrise, because by the end of this story, it may be hard to believe he was ever that same person at all. They married when Sarah was 26, in a small backyard ceremony behind her parents' house in Springfield, with folding chairs borrowed from a neighbor and a cake her mother baked herself, because they couldn't afford anything fancier. Daniel's mother, Linda, cried through most of the ceremony. Rachel gave a toast that had the whole yard laughing until people were wiping their eyes. Something about the time Daniel had tried to impress Sarah by cooking dinner and nearly set off the smoke alarm in his apartment. For the first 10 years, their life together looked, from the outside, like everything people hope a marriage will become. A modest house in a quiet neighborhood outside Columbus, a trip to the Smoky Mountains every autumn, always the same small cabin, always the same trail on the first morning, a tradition that started almost by accident on their honeymoon and simply never stopped. Sarah remembers those early years of marriage in small, specific pictures more than in any single grand memory. Daniel learning to make her mother's chili recipe and burning it twice before finally getting it right. The two of them repainting the kitchen together one weekend and arguing over paint swatches that, in hindsight, looked almost identical. Sunday mornings spent in bed with coffee and the newspaper long after either of them still read an actual newspaper for the news, simply because it was a habit they liked keeping alive between them. Rachel used to say she had never seen two people fit together so easily, finishing each other's sentences at family dinners, laughing at private jokes no one else in the room understood. Somewhere around year 12, something in Daniel began to change, so slowly that Sarah spent months convincing herself she was imagining it. He started staying at the office later, first by 30 minutes, then an hour, then 2. He grew protective of his phone in a way he'd never been before, turning it face down the second she walked into a room. When she asked him gently what was going on, he laughed it off, told her she was overthinking a stressful season at work, and for a long time, she chose to believe him, because believing him took far less courage than doubting him did. Sarah has said, looking back, that the strangest part of that slow unraveling wasn't any single big moment. It was how ordinary everything still looked from the outside. While it was happening, they still went to the same friends' barbecues. They still took their autumn trip to the mountains, though she remembers Daniel seeming distracted on that last trip, checking his phone at the overlook where they always used to just stand quietly together and take in the view. She remembers feeling a flicker of something uneasy in that moment and pushing it back down, telling herself it was nothing, the way she'd taught herself to do with every small warning sign that came before it. About 4 months before the accident, on an ordinary Thursday evening, Daniel asked her, almost in passing over dinner, whether she'd ever updated her will. At the time, sitting at their kitchen table with a glass of wine in her hand, she thought the question was thoughtful, even a little sweet, the kind of practical concern a caring husband might raise out of nowhere. She had no way of knowing that she was already quietly being written out of a future Daniel had begun building without her. Looking back now, she describes that dinner as the first small thread in a pattern she wouldn't fully understand until months later, lying in a hospital bed, listening to her husband speak 5 words meant for someone else entirely. In the weeks after that dinner, Sarah noticed other small things she chose not to examine too closely at the time. Daniel started going to the gym at strange hours, sometimes leaving at 9 at night and not coming home until well past midnight. He dressed differently for ordinary weekend errands, in shirts she'd never once seen him wear to run to the grocery store. He grew short with her over things that used to roll right off him, sighing at questions he once would have answered without a second thought. Her mother asked her once, over the phone, if everything was all right between her and Daniel. Sarah said yes without hesitating, because at that point in her life, saying no out loud still felt like more than she was ready to carry. There is one memory from that final stretch before the accident that Sarah has said she returns to often, almost against her will. About 2 weeks before the crash, she and Daniel were watching television together on the couch, an ordinary Friday night, and during a commercial break she reached over and took his hand, the way she had done 1,000 times over 15 years. She remembers him letting her hold it for a moment, before gently, almost automatically, pulling it back to check something on his phone. She didn't say anything about it that night. She has said since that it was such a small thing, and yet it is the moment she thinks about most, the quiet withdrawal of a hand that used to always be there for her to hold. The morning of the accident began like any other Tuesday. Sarah remembers the coffee maker sputtering the way it always did, the sound of Daniel's keys scraping against the counter, the ordinary rhythm of a marriage that, on the surface, still looked whole. She kissed him goodbye at the door, the same quick, slightly distracted kiss they'd shared 1,000 times before, never once suspecting it would be the last ordinary morning she would have with him. She grabbed her travel mug, checked her bag twice out of habit, and backed out of the driveway at 7:45, exactly like she did every weekday morning. She merged onto the same road she had driven for 6 years without a single problem. She had no reason to believe that morning would be any different from the one before it. She was wrong. Sarah doesn't remember the impact itself. She remembers the sound just before it, a horn blaring too late, tires screaming against wet pavement, and then nothing at all, a silence so total it felt as though the world had simply stopped existing around her. The next thing she became aware of was a stranger's hands cutting through her seatbelt, a voice telling her to stay still, that help was already coming, that she needed to keep her eyes open just a little longer. She couldn't have moved even if she'd wanted to. A truck had run a red light at full speed, and her small car had taken the weight of it, folding around her like it was made of nothing at all. At the hospital, the surgeon who operated on her used the word miracle more than once, while speaking to her family in the waiting room. Her lung had partially collapsed. Several ribs were broken. There was internal bleeding severe enough that the surgical team spent hours working, just to be sure she would make it through the night. Daniel sat in that waiting room through the whole surgery, and Rachel remembers him seeming strangely calm for a man whose wife was fighting for her life only a few rooms away, his eyes drifting to his phone again and again in a way that felt, even then, slightly out of place. When the surgeon finally came out and said the word miracle, Sarah later learned that Daniel had used a very different word to describe her condition to someone else, someone he didn't think was listening. He called it complicated. Rachel has said that in those first raw hours, she was too consumed with fear for her sister's life to pay much attention to anything else. It was only in the days that followed, once the immediate danger had passed and the long, slow work of healing began, that the smaller, quieter wrongness of Daniel's behavior started to stand out against everything else happening around them. She noticed it first in the little things. The way he'd step out to take a call and come back with his expression rearranged into something calmer than it had any right to be. The way he asked the nurses more questions about discharge timelines than he ever asked about how Sarah was actually feeling. In the days that followed the surgery, Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of visitors, aware of the steady beeping of machines, aware of Daniel sitting beside her, though something about his presence had started to feel hollow, like a shape standing in for the man himself. Rachel noticed it before Sarah did, the way his eyes kept drifting toward the door, the way his visits grew shorter with each passing day, the way he answered questions with half sentences instead of whole ones, like part of him had already left the room before the rest of him caught up. Sarah told herself he was simply frightened, simply exhausted, simply overwhelmed by nearly losing her. She wanted, more than anything, to believe that was the whole truth of it. There was a particular afternoon, about 2 weeks into her recovery, when Sarah asked Daniel to bring her a specific sweater from home, one she kept in the bottom drawer of their dresser for cold hospital rooms. He came back the next day with the wrong one entirely, something she hadn't worn in years, and when she gently pointed out the mistake, he snapped at her in a way he never had before, telling her it was just a sweater, that he had more important things to worry about than which one she meant. She remembers lying there afterward, staring at the ceiling, wondering what exactly those more important things could possibly be, when the woman he'd vowed to spend his life with was still recovering from injuries that had nearly killed her 3 weeks earlier. 3 weeks after the accident, on a night Sarah remembers with more clarity than almost any other night of her life, she was drifting toward sleep when she heard Daniel's voice just outside her door. He believed she was sedated enough not to hear him, his tone low but unmistakably warm, a warmth she hadn't felt directed at her in longer than she wanted to admit, the same warmth she remembered from the early years of their marriage, now meant for somebody else. "I can't keep doing this back and forth," he said. And then, after a pause that felt to her like an entire lifetime, he said the 5 words that would end their marriage before either of them ever spoke the word divorce out loud. "Call me when she dies. Then we can actually talk." Sarah lay perfectly still, her eyes closed, her chest aching with every breath the machine helped pull into her lungs, and in that exact moment, she made a quiet decision that would shape everything that came after. She would not confront him that night. She would not cry out, would not demand answers, would not give him the satisfaction of knowing she had heard a single word of it. Instead, she would simply pay attention. She would hold what she now knew close to her chest, the way you hold something fragile, and she would let the rest of the truth come to her in its own time. Daniel believed his wife was too weak and too broken to do anything with what he'd said. He had no idea how wrong that belief was about to prove to be. The days after that hallway conversation moved differently for Sarah. She has said that lying in that bed, unable to do much more than breathe and think, she found herself replaying every strange moment from the past year. The late nights, the face-down phone, the sudden question about her will, the sweater that came back wrong, and watching them line up into a shape she had refused to see before. She wasn't looking for proof yet. She was simply, finally, allowing herself to believe her own instincts, something she realized she had stopped doing somewhere around year 12 of her marriage, without ever noticing she'd let it go. She has described those nights in the hospital, once the lights went dim and the hallway noise quieted, as some of the loneliest of her entire life, and also, strangely, some of the clearest. Lying there with nothing to do but think, she began to see her marriage not as one long, steady thing that had suddenly broken, but as something that had been slowly hollowing out for years, the way a tree can look healthy from the outside, while it's already rotting through at the center. She remembers thinking, somewhere in the middle of one of those long nights, that she had spent so many years trying to hold her marriage together that she had never once stopped to ask whether Daniel was even still trying to hold it together with her. Once she was discharged and settled into Rachel's guest room to continue healing, Sarah began quietly piecing together the last year of her life with Daniel. Late at night, when the house had gone still, she and Rachel would sit together going through old statements and messages, not as investigators, but as 2 sisters trying to understand how a marriage could look so whole on the outside while quietly hollowing out underneath. Rachel has said those nights were some of the hardest of her own life too, watching her sister discover, piece by piece, just how long she had been lied to, and having to sit there and witness it without being able to take any of the pain away from her. They found a second account Sarah had never known existed, and a name that kept appearing again and again in the months before the accident. Calls that grew longer as the weeks passed. At first, Sarah believed there was only one woman. She later learned there had briefly been 2, though one of them faded from the picture almost as quickly as she'd appeared, leaving Sarah with more questions than answers for a while, before the truth settled into focus. The other woman, a co-worker named Ashley Coleman, had actually stood in the crowd at Sarah and Daniel's wedding 12 years earlier, smiling in photographs Sarah still had in an old album somewhere in that same closet as the shoebox of notes. Sarah has said that finding that photograph again, after everything, was one of the strangest moments of the entire ordeal, staring at a smiling face that had been quietly present in her life for over a decade without her ever suspecting a thing. There were other things Sarah found too, quieter things that hurt in a different way than the calls did. A conversation with a real estate agent about their house that Daniel had never once mentioned to her, a change to his life insurance that replaced his own mother as the person he trusted with something important, without a single word to Sarah about it. None of it told her for certain whether the crash itself had been anything other than terrible bad luck, and she has always been careful to say she'll never know that part for sure. But it told her everything she needed to know about the man lying beside her every night for 15 years, and about how long he had quietly been planning a life that no longer had room for her in it. Sarah found a lawyer, a steady, unhurried woman named Diane, who helped her make sense of everything she and Rachel had gathered, not by turning it into a case, but by helping Sarah simply understand her own story clearly enough to finally stand on solid ground when she faced Daniel again. Diane found an old folder among some forgotten emails, dated 3 weeks before the accident had even happened, and reading through it, Sarah felt something in her chest go cold in a way that was different from anything she'd felt before. Daniel had already been planning his exit, quietly, methodically, long before she ever got into her car that Tuesday morning, believing her biggest problem that day was beating traffic. While all of this was unfolding, Sarah spent her afternoons with Marcus, her physical therapist, slowly learning to stand without help, then to walk the length of a hallway, then eventually to climb a single flight of stairs without stopping to catch her breath halfway up. Marcus has said he could see something shift in Sarah around the same time her recovery started accelerating, a new kind of determination that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than simple physical willpower. She has said that learning to walk again and learning the truth about her marriage became, in her mind, the very same project, both requiring a kind of patience she didn't know she had, until life demanded she find it somewhere inside herself. There was one afternoon during physical therapy, several months into her recovery, when Sarah managed to walk the full length of the hospital hallway, unassisted for the first time since the accident. She remembers reaching the end of that hallway, out of breath, her legs shaking, and feeling something close to pride for the first time in months. A small, private victory that had nothing to do with Daniel at all. She has said that moment mattered to her more than almost anything that came afterward in the legal process, because it was the first proof she had that her body, at least, was still entirely her own to rebuild. When Sarah finally sat across from Daniel again, it wasn't loud or dramatic the way she had imagined it might be during the angrier nights of her recovery. It was quiet, she told him, calmly, that she knew about the hallway, about the woman, about the folder, about all of it, and she watched something in his face give way, not into an apology exactly, but into the exhaustion of a man who had run out of ways to explain himself. He told her he'd been under a lot of stress, that he hadn't meant it the way it sounded. Sarah told him she didn't need him to explain the sentence to her at all. She had understood it perfectly the first time, standing 12 feet away in a bed she couldn't even leave. She has described that meeting since as strangely anticlimactic, not because it didn't matter, but because she had already done the hardest part of the work long before she ever sat down across from him. The anger, the disbelief, the grief, all of it had already moved through her in the quiet hours of the hospital and the guest room at Rachel's house. By the time she faced him, what was left wasn't rage. It was simply clarity and a strange, tired kind of peace that came from finally saying the truth out loud to the one person who had spent months pretending she didn't already know it. The months that followed their separation were harder in ways Sarah hadn't expected. Some friends she'd known for over a decade sided unexpectedly with Daniel, telling her privately that she should have found a way to look past it, that marriages survive worse than a few careless words. Sarah lost those friendships, and she has said openly that this particular loss stung in a quieter, more lingering way than Daniel's betrayal itself ever did. She remembers one friend in particular, a woman she had known since college, telling her that she was making too much of one bad sentence said during a stressful time, and Sarah has said that conversation taught her something important, that not everyone who claims to love you will actually stand beside you when standing beside you becomes inconvenient. But Sarah also found something she hadn't expected in its place. Rachel never once wavered. Marcus kept showing up for every session with the same steady patience. And slowly, as pieces of her story reached people she'd never met, she found herself surrounded by strangers who simply wanted her to know she wasn't imagining any of it, that they had seen the same quiet unraveling happen in their own lives and never had the words for it until they heard someone else say it first. She has said that discovering this kind of unexpected kindness, from people who owed her nothing at all, helped her rebuild her trust in the world almost as much as the recovery of her own body did. Daniel moved out of state within the year. Sarah later heard, through someone who still occasionally passed along news she hadn't asked for, that his relationship with Ashley hadn't lasted much longer after the divorce was finalized. She has said she felt no real satisfaction hearing that. Only a quiet, tired confirmation of something she had already suspected long before it happened, that a life built on someone else's pain rarely holds together once that pain is no longer close enough to distract from the cracks forming underneath it. Sarah's full recovery, in every sense of the word, took the better part of 2 years. Relearning to walk without support, rebuilding strength in a lung that would never quite work the way it used to. She has said her body and her heart seemed to heal at strangely similar paces during that whole stretch, both slow, both painful in ways hard to explain to anyone who hadn't lived through either one. She eventually moved into a small house of her own, close enough to Rachel that they still see each other most weekends, far enough from her old life that she rarely has reason to pass the hospital where all of this truly began. She describes her new home now with a kind of quiet fondness, a small 2-bedroom house with a garden she started the first spring after she moved in, mostly tomatoes and a stubborn rosebush that took 2 full years to finally bloom. She has said there is something deeply satisfying about growing something slowly, season after season, after spending so long watching something she thought was permanent fall apart in the space of a single hallway conversation. The garden, she says, taught her patience all over again, but this time it was patience she chose for herself, rather than patience forced on her by circumstance. She kept the shoebox of notes from those early years, tucked now into a closet in her new home, not out of any lingering sentimentality, she says, but as a quiet reminder of how convincingly a person can change, without ever announcing that the change is happening. She still reads through them sometimes, not with sadness anymore, but with a kind of curiosity, wondering at what exact point the boy who wrote them started slipping away, and whether there was ever a moment she might have caught it. If only she had known what to look for. About a year after everything was finalized, Daniel reached out once, a short message asking how she was doing, phrased in a way that hoped for some kind of forgiveness, offered entirely on his own terms. Sarah didn't answer with anger. She simply didn't answer at all, and she has said, more than once, that her silence felt more powerful than anything she could have written back. People often ask her if she's forgiven him. Her answer has stayed the same every time. Forgiveness isn't the same thing as forgetting, she says, and her healing was never something that needed his permission to begin with. Rachel has said, reflecting on everything her sister went through, that the moment she is proudest of isn't the divorce, or the folder Diane found, or even the day Sarah walked the length of that hospital hallway unassisted for the first time. It's the quiet moment, 3 weeks into her recovery, when Sarah lay in that hospital bed listening to the worst sentence of her life, and chose stillness over collapse, patience over panic, and quietly decided she would be the one still standing at the end of it, however long that took. Looking back now, Sarah says the hardest part was never the physical pain, difficult as that recovery truly was. The hardest part was realizing that the man she had built 15 years of her life around was capable of standing 12 feet from her hospital bed and speaking about her death as though it were simply a scheduling problem standing between him and a future he had already quietly begun building without her. She wants anyone hearing her story today to ask themselves one honest question. If you were in her place, recovering, vulnerable, suddenly realizing the person closest to you in the world had quietly become a stranger wearing a familiar face, would you have seen it coming sooner than she did, or would you, like her, have needed to hear it in his own voice before you finally let yourself believe it? She still keeps a small photograph on her nightstand, not of Daniel, but of the hospital hallway itself, taken the day she was finally discharged. She says she doesn't look at it with anger anymore, most days. She looks at it the way you look back at a marker on a long road, proof that she made it through the hardest stretch and kept walking anyway, one careful step at a time, until walking on her own stopped feeling like a miracle and simply started feeling like her life again. Sarah has said, in the years since, that she doesn't tell this story to make anyone hate Daniel, or even to make anyone feel sorry for her. She tells it because there was a version of herself, lying in that hospital bed 3 years ago, who needed to hear that surviving something like this was possible, and she never had anyone to tell her so at the time. If even one person hearing her story tonight recognizes something familiar in it, some quiet warning sign they've been talking themselves out of the way she once did, she hopes it gives them the courage to finally look at it clearly, the way she eventually found the courage to look at her own life clearly, one hospital hallway at a time. If Sarah's story stayed with you the way it has stayed with so many people who have heard it before you, let us know in the comments which part touched you the most, and whether you saw the same warning signs in her story that she once missed in her own life. And if you haven't already, subscribe now, because next week we're bringing you another story,